Good afternoon. This is Eric Mucklow from Headquarters Corps of Engineers. This is the Sustainability and Energy webinar series. Today we have with us Dr. Kate White. She'll be presenting on climate preparedness and resilience assessments, along with an example of how we're working toward adaptation by updating our drought contingency plans and account for climate change. Kate White is a civil engineer with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Institute for Water Resources. She holds a BS and MS degrees in civil engineering and a PhD in civil and environmental engineering, and she is a registered professional engineer. She has more than 26 years of Corps of Engineers experience and has emphasized hydrology and hydraulics supporting planning, engineering, design, operations, and emergency management. As the senior lead for global and climate change, her work incorporates anticipatory management in the face of dynamic global changes to enhance preparedness and resilience so that the Corps of Engineers will remain adaptable and sustainable over time. Kate is the lead of the Corps of Engineers Climate Preparedness and Resilience Community of Practice. With that, I will give it over to Dr. White.
Thanks, Eric. Can everybody hear me all right? I'm going to go on to the next chart. Eric just gave you an idea of what the outline is. We'll be covering the USACE Climate Change Adaptation Plan, talking about policy guidance and tools, and some other activities that are going on in the Corps now to help our climate preparedness and resilience. So first, the Corps of Engineers files a climate adaptation plan every year. It's gone in up till now with the Sustainability Plan, generally filed in June. In 2011, we filed a plan in September. In 2012 and 2013, we filed one in June. We filed an update in the lower right-hand corner. Here is our update that we had to file with CEQ and OMB in March of this year. And following, which we'll update and supply again in June. The first three are public and they're available on our coreclimate.us site. The URL is on the bottom of the slide there, and the slides will be available to you so that you can just hyperlink to those. The one we submitted in March won't be made public until after June when CEQ and OMB finish their review and allow the agencies to release them publicly. The National Climate Assessment by the U.S. Global Change Research Program is going to be released on 6th May, and thereafter is planned to be released every 4 years. And at that point, after this first one is released, they're going to move to an every 4-year schedule for the adaptation plans. So that's subject to change without notice. This year, the new Executive Order 13653, Preparing the United States for the Impacts of Climate Change, which was released in November, and the President's Climate Action Plan, called the CAP here, which was released in June of 2013, both add new information that we're required to address in our adaptation plan. And in part, that's why CEQ and OMB wanted to see a draft in March, just to make sure that we were working on these. Some of the areas covered in these new areas covered are vulnerabilities to the supply chains, international activities that show leadership for the Corps in climate adaptation, and integrating adaptation and mitigation. The supply chain is interesting because, like few other agencies, the Corps is actually on the supply side of the supply chain in terms of our very large projects, our construction projects, our dredging projects, the kind of normal operation and maintenance that we do with our projects. But we're also on the supplier side through our navigation mission. And the navigation mission is impacted by floods and by drought and by other activities as well. But the way that we operate to maintain navigation, maintain that supply chain for others, whether it's other agencies or state and local officials or private sector, that's going to be an important factor for us to address in the new plan. So, next, I'm showing the climate change adaptation roadmap. The roadmap guides how we what actions we take on adaptation. It's led by the Adaptation Steering Committee, chaired by Mr. Dalton, who's the Chief of Engineering Construction, and the major SESers at headquarters, from planning, from ops and regulatory, from contingency operations, and from installations, and from CERD, the research and development folks, are on the steering committee and help to make the decisions that guide what we're working on. Generally, we have 4 major strategies: focus on priority areas, engage in meaningful collaboration externally, improve our knowledge, and develop policy and guidance. The areas shown in blue here are the ones that I'm going to talk about today, though you can read about all of them in the adaptation plans that are posted on the site. So I'm going to talk about infrastructure resilience, vulnerability assessments, non-stationarity, and then collaboration, knowledge, and policy and guidance. So first of all, the priority area of infrastructure resilience is really important to the Corps. I'm not talking here about the dam and levee safety program. I'm really talking about the kind of the rest of the missions that we're dealing with, the non-safety program missions, flood risk reduction, coastal risk reduction, ecosystem restoration, navigation, hydropower, water supply, etc., emergency response. And so in September, at the request of Mr. Stockton, the Director of Civil Works, and General Walsh, who was at that time the DCG CEO, we put out a report called Coastal Risk Reduction and Resilience. And this was in part due to questions that came up during the early Sandy recovery response. People wanted to know, was the Corps going to be considering greener, natural and nature-based infrastructure as we move forward with the Sandy recovery? And the response was basically, we've been doing that for a long time. And a couple of examples I'm showing here. The Jadwin report after the flood of 1927 required us to obtain easements in areas to allow floodplains to carry the flow. The one that people are probably familiar with after the flood of 2011 is the Birds Point, New Madrid floodway, where the Corps had a fused plug levee that they needed to blow up to allow the water to go into the upper end of that spillway, although at the lower end there's a gap that allows water to go in during many years. So the idea that the Corps is using the natural benefits of floodways is not a new idea. Another example I'm giving is the Mississippi Coastal Improvement Project that came after Hurricane Katrina, and here they were really looking at the idea of restoring barrier and nearshore islands and moving private lands into the public sector. In other words, a retreat or land swap idea to move people out of the disaster area. So this report basically says that natural and nature-based systems can improve the quality and resilience of the economic, ecological, and social systems, and that we should be using multiple lines of defense. It also says, however, that we really need to take a look at if we're going to be requiring coastal risk reduction performance out of these natural and nature-based measures. We really need to know about that performance. So next, natural and nature-based infrastructure at a glance. These figures are available for your use on the website, which is shown below, where the coastal risk reduction and resiliency report is. But it kind of gives you an idea of the benefits and processes of these natural and nature-based infrastructure and the performance factors that are involved. So I'm just going to go through here. Next, non-structural and floodproofing measures at a glance. I'm sure most of you know that the Corps has a national floodproofing, non-structural floodproofing committee. Randy Bean from Omaha District is the lead for that, and they do quite a bit of work helping people to identify different kinds of non-structural measures that can be taken to reduce flood risk. I'm showing a slide here from New York City after Hurricane Sandy because I think sometimes looking at outside agencies may give you a better idea of how you might consider non-structural and floodproofing measures. And they did kind of a clever report. This is the wastewater agency. They did a clever report where they looked at the adaptation strategy and provided a figure for it to kind of get people looking and getting them engaged in the pictures. And then they give you a little kind of dial, low, medium, or high, and the resiliency or effectiveness scale, and then cost, many dollars or a few dollars. And so here we're looking at elevating equipment, floodproofing it, static barriers, etc. And all of these measures have been used and should be considered by Corps people in their kinds of projects. So next, we're all more familiar with the structural measures because we are an engineering agency and we've been using these for a long time. So these are, again, the idea of the description of the measures, the benefits and the processes, and the performance factors. The other thing that's important to note about these kind of measures, especially when you're trying to do an integrated system, is to consider the performance range over which they perform the best. So it's a little bit of a confusing graph, but if you look on the y-axis, we're going from low to high in terms of urbanization. And again, it's just illustrative, it's not quantitative. So a low road development might be coastal marshes with medium density residential behind it. We might move into an oceanfront beach with low density or medium density residential, and then we might move into industrial or densely populated areas or commercial areas. So moving from low to high in urbanization. Now when we consider sea level change, it would be the current level and then the future level, the higher sea levels. And I'm going to leave Alaska aside for a moment where we do have some local relative sea level fall. And then from storm impacts, coastal storms might be low impact storms and high impact storms. So you see that the salt marshes and the forests and the dunes and beaches and whatnot generally perform really well in the kind of current situation, although they can migrate to perform over time in the future. And for relatively low levels of storm impacts. So these are really well suited for dealing with those really frequent events, frequent low energy type events. When we get into higher sea level change and higher storm impact, the typical structural things like surge barriers and seawalls and breakwaters, they tend to function better, especially when in a more urbanized environment. But I want you to notice this purple area here, the really largest area is the non-structural floodproofing area. And so the idea here is to get people to really think about how do you include non-structural and floodproofing, how do you maybe look at a managed retreat farther into the future to deal with your climate issues. The next thing is looking at suitability ranges, or what are the kinds of options that you have. So New York City, I'm giving as another example, structures that you might consider that are actually in the water, constructed wetlands, altering the morphology, building polders, on up through floating islands, to things like groins, breakwaters, and surge barriers. So just some alternatives, and again, the URLs on the bottom of the slide. Then we think about shoreline measures. We look at our natural, nature-based beaches and dunes, levees or dikes, multi-purpose kinds of levees with, say, a tunnel underneath. We might move through bulkheads, revetments, living shorelines, very popular in the sandy area, especially on the bay side, seawalls. And then in the upland areas, you're looking at elevation of not just houses, but lands and streets, looking at waterfront parks to entice people to move, retreat farther back, but allow them to have access to an improved environment, flood walls, and then retreat over time. So this would be the retreat area, and this is the non-retreat area. So that's kind of switching now gears from the priority area of the infrastructure resilience. I'm going to move into non-stationarity, which is very important in hydrology, and it's really one of the assumptions that we've made in hydrology for a long time, that the hydrologic time series data are constant over time. We've made the assumption that they're constant, but we do have methods that allow us to look at changes in land use, land cover that have altered the hydrology. But stationarity is a foundational concept that alters, the lack of stationarity will alter how we do things in the future. And so here's an example. This is the annual minimum daily discharge, Big Sioux River at Akron, Ohio. This is from about 1920 to, on the scale, this is 2010. And then mean discharge in CFS from 0 to 600 on the y-axis. And what you see for this minimum daily discharge is that they're fairly low till about 1980, and then they start to vary wildly. And this is a signal of an increase in variability, not necessarily a change in the mean, although one would maybe think that the mean is now up here compared to where it was earlier. But it's definitely a change in the variability of the annual minimum daily discharge. And we're showing minimum daily discharge because people tend to think of climate change in terms of floods, and you really need to look at the entire flow frequency curve for our design. And this is particularly important for our ecosystem restoration, our water supply projects, and our navigation projects. So the work now is to find a suitable successor for a non-stationary, and we've been working with a lot of other agencies on this topic. So our approach here is to improve our knowledge in a logical, rational, legally justifiable manner and consistent with the other agencies, so that when we come up with a solution to deal with non-stationary hydrology in a given watershed, our partner agencies are using the same type of solution. We don't want to come in very radically different than Reclamation or than NOAA or than NRCS. So we began in 2010 with a workshop in Boulder to look at non-stationarity. This was attended by national and international experts. It was run by several agencies. We produced a proceedings, and then perhaps more importantly, a year later in 2011, we had a special proceedings in a journal collection in the Journal of the American Water Resources Association. And this idea of collaboration, although not new, was especially useful to us because so many people were interested in this. And we had a number of Nobel laureates from the IPCC who attended this, and really think that the information that we got out of this to move forward really helped us set a good foundation for us in the future. So we've been working on this area for a number of years. We've been working with academic folks and other agencies, and for our academic partners, we have supported the production of peer-reviewed journal papers that will underlie our policy when we're ready to go on that. And that's really important because it's that peer review that sets the tone of the scientific justification and the legally justified activities that we're undertaking. The next thing that we're working together on is climate hydrology. It's practically a burgeoning, or maybe burgeoned already, cottage industry out there to downscale hydrology. Everybody wants to downscale to a really local level. And the issue that the water management agencies are finding is that the native scale of the general circulation models, the big atmospheric ocean models, is a very large scale. And we feel that every time we downscale that, every time we move down in resolution, take that information, make it finer resolution, we're actually adding a lot of uncertainty. So the water agencies got together, and by water agencies I mean the Corps and Reclamation and USGS. We got together with other agencies, including Climate Central, Scripps Institute, Santa Clara University, and others, to put together a site, an archive, that would build on existing archives. And we developed downscaled CMIP3 and CMIP5 climate projections, and then we're developing hydrology projections for that. And it's important because we're providing a service that not just the Corps or Reclamation or the other agencies involved, but our partners and stakeholders can use, and we feel that it's at the resolution that we're confident in. So I'm going to go over a few terms here. So CMIP3, Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, is CMIP3 supported the 2007 IPCC report, and the CMIP5 model supported the report that one of the three parts of the report came out in September, and then the other one was just released the other day. Then there'll be a third part to come out. So we have the CMIP5, which is the newest downscaling the newest climate models, and then we're using the bias correction spatially disaggregated downscaling method, which is a statistical method. It's not a dynamical method. And then we're running, for the hydrology, we're running that through the variable infiltration capacity hydrology model. So we have various combinations of the general circulation models, the big atmospheric ocean models, and the representative concentration pathways, which replace the greenhouse gas emission scenarios from the CMIP3. So these various combinations result in about 100 traces per watershed per time period, 100 data values, which allows us to start to be more confident about the depth and range of the information that we're getting. So we've moved this into the Corps Oracle database, and we're working on tools and methods to provide Corps staff the ability to get at these and use them in the way we think is appropriate. But this archive, you can get them directly from the archive, but it's not really a simple method, and what we'd like to do is develop tools so everybody comes in and can get repeatable analytical results with the same data. We don't want there to be some subjective issues where we're getting different results. So that's the archive. It's pretty important. The next thing the agencies have been doing is working together on climate hydrology training. because there wasn't any climate hydrology training. We figured we'd work together to develop training that we felt was useful to us and to our partners. So we've had a couple of residence classes, and we just recently started some online courses, which are shown here. And there's URLs that can tell you how to get to them. But one of them is this Introduction to the Downscaled Climate Hydrology Projections website. And these are free. You can get on. You just have to give yourself an ID in the COMET system. The COMET is from the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, which provides the training for us. And this will tell you how to actually use the information that's on the archive that I showed on the previous slide. So now moving on from some of those external collaboration activities, I want to touch on adaptation policy and guidance. In the coastal arena, we've been pretty active in the Corps for a long time. One area is the use of consistent datums, and this is very important, particularly in coastal areas. We learned the hard way during Hurricane Katrina that we must be on consistent datums, and we have a project ongoing to bring every project into compliance with our datum regulation that's shown here, and using the methods in the engineer manual. Next, we've been working on sea level change for a long time. 1986, we first had a letter that said, consider changing sea levels. I'm just going to skip right on to 2000, when our planning guidance told us we need to understand the sensitivity to both the historic and the National Research Council 1987 report, which proposed a high rate of sea level change. But in between there, we have a number of really good reports and studies put out by districts that were very far ahead of their time. So it's not that we hadn't been doing anything in between. In 2009, one of our post-Katrina actions tied to the datums that I just mentioned was to really put into place guidance about using 3 scenarios of sea level change. In 2013, these 2 engineer circulars were updated to a regulation, and we've got signed now an engineer technical letter 1100-2-1 that was signed in February, and it's in publishing. The Coastal Working Group has been using this, and it's available for people to use. It's got a draft watermark on it until it's finalized, which, when it's in publishing, it's at ACIT, and it can take a while, but we think that we're fairly close. We also put out guidance on our post-Sandy flood risk recovery standard, and another simple engineering construction bulletin on the use of non-NOAA tide gauges. And now we're looking at an engineer technical letter on incorporating that sea level change in design water levels. And we kind of shortcut this as the extreme water levels, and the draft is expected this year. So we're making good progress in coastal. The next adaptation policy and guidance for hydrology, we're farther behind, and that's really largely because we're still exploring with other agencies and experts how to deal with the non-stationary issue. So we have a draft ECB on the use of qualitative methods in hydrology, and that's expected to be signed, Friday. It was supposed to be last week, but there was a TDY. So we're expecting that this week. It's been vetted through the agency and with other agencies and external groups. Essentially, we have to identify whether climate change is relevant to the particular project goals or the design. And if it is relevant, then we have to evaluate regional climate synthesis information from reputable sources, focus on specific effects of climate change on the hydrologic metric or metrics of interest. So this could be, as I showed before, the minimum daily flow, or it could be a flood flow, or whatever the hydrologic metric of interest is. And it gives an example of how to conduct a first-order statistical assessment using data pulled from the archive that I talked about earlier. Let's see, anything else on this one? I guess not on this. It's going to be followed by quantitative guidance probably in the next couple of years. I guess I put calendar year 2015 down here. We're working on that already in the flood risk area, and that's probably going to be released as a series of guidance documents for the different business lines. We also have a technical letter on appropriate uses of paleoflood hydrology that's going to be coming out early summer 2014. The use of paleoflood hydrology information can help you extend the record, the hydrologic record, which gives you more confidence in the statistical results that you get. We also have a draft technical letter on how to detect non-stationarities in annual maximum peak discharge. This can be a little more subtle than the example I showed you earlier with the minimum discharge, where it's pretty clear that things were changing. So we have a draft on that, and we hope to have it out before the end of the FY. Again, our quantitative approach here. So we're working on hydrology, and we're building on the products that we've already developed under non-stationary, our journal papers, the archive, and our training information. So next I want to move to tools that help us work on the guidance. And the first one is our sea level calculator, which is really a pretty simple tool. It's web accessible, so we have access to it, our partners have access to it. It uses NOAA tide gauges plus the selected non-NOAA tide gauges that I mentioned that we have a guidance out on. We have, of course, the Corps of Engineers scenarios, but we also provide the NOAA scenarios that came out in a December 2012 joint interagency report headed by NOAA, but including the Corps, that provided input to the National Climate Assessment, which is going to be released next week. And the NOAA scenarios are very similar to ours in the field, that they pretty much just really agree with ours and support ours. So it's pretty simple. You pick a gauge with a drop-down menu, and then you get a picture of the 3 sea level scenarios, and you get a picture of the location of the gauge, and you get a table telling you the information that you're looking for. And the idea here is, although we had a method, people were trying to calculate this in all different kinds of ways. They did it by hand, they did it with spreadsheets, they wrote little MATLAB scripts, and we weren't getting repeatable results. And so now the purpose of this is to get those repeatable results, and also to allow people to get a first look at what might be the sea levels that they have to deal with in a project. And certainly if you have a very high cost, high consequence project, you're probably going to be doing detailed hydrodynamic modeling. But this gets you at least through the recon and into the feasibility phase. So the calculator also supports comparisons, as I mentioned. This top one is a comparison of the Corps and NOAA scenarios. The 2 bottom scenarios, this is year from, this is 1990 to 2110, and this is sea level change in meters, and it's on a relative sea level change in meters. And this shows that the Corps and NOAA are the same for our 2 lower scenarios. And of course, we're red for the Corps, and our high scenario lies here, and NOAA has an intermediate high and a high. Their high scenario runs out about 2.5 meters or so at 2100. I guess it's 2 meters at 2100. And it's something that we've said is a credible upper maximum bound, and we allow people to use the NOAA scenarios in the reports, not to replace ours, but to use them if they want. Another report recently was the NRC report on West Coast sea level rise. Again, the Corps' low, intermediate, and high curves. And these gray bars represent the suggestions of the National Research Council in that Western States report. So we provide a way for people to compare to that. Also, for the City of New York, they have a New York City Panel on Climate Change, the NPCC, and we work with them to show how our curves and their information fit together. So again, low, intermediate, and high for the Corps. They have a 10th percentile, a 90th percentile, and then this green shaded area is between the 25th and 75th percentile. And I guess after working for several months on and off tinkering with this, it really shows me the difference between actionable science, which is we're giving you a scenario approach to the future that's continuous, that allows you to design over time, to a science approach which says, there's your 10th and 90th, and then this range in the middle, but doesn't really give you an idea of anything else. And you also don't really know what to do in the middle. Do you just do an interpolation between each one? Do you smooth them out over time? So anyway, this is the difference between science and actionable science here. Next, we have the coastal tools that I just mentioned are supporting our Corps of Engineers vulnerability assessments, which are required by CEQ and OMB. So we've had an effort going on called the Comprehensive Evaluation with Respect to Sea Level Change, or CESL, going on for a few years now. First, we built an Oracle-based tool on CoreMap, the Corps' geospatial database. We did an initial screening level assessment. First, we screened out anything that was greater than 40 miles from the coastline. And of those, which were about 2,200 projects, well, actually initially more, but now are being decreased by the district. We're looking at about a little over 2,000 projects that we're doing an initial assessment on to say whether they're impacted or not. And there'll be further, more detailed assessments to follow this. We're going to be setting priorities and looking at the level of effort. Two potential ways to do these detailed analyses are provided by a pilot that's looking at a Stamford, Connecticut hurricane barrier in the Union District, and a really nice detailed project done by ERDIC for the SERDIP, Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program at Hampton Roads, which gives a really nice example of how you would use very detailed asset information with sea level to see how different kinds of events would affect the different assets that you need to perform. In this case, it was 2 Navy piers to keep those Navy piers operating as required. So this is just a screenshot from our coastal vulnerability assessment. It's CAC enabled, so we just sign in, sits on the Oracle database, pulls a lot of information automatically. It pulls data directly from the NOAA and approved non-NOAA tide gauges, uses the sea level calculator. The user validates a lot of the information, and then we ask them to input a critical elevation for the particular project and estimate the consequences. And estimating the consequences is something like less than 5 million, 5 to 50 million, or I guess it's less than 50 million, 50 to 500, and more than 500 million in damages if we have a failure. And it provides summary reports, and it helps lead to the next phase of testing. So again, here's our curves, low, intermediate, and high, with some critical information that's plotted on here. So it doesn't take all that long to do. I see that we have a couple people on our list who've actually worked on this, and they could provide information on how long it took to do them. But one thing that we've added to this is the ability to look at not just the sea level rise, but the other design water levels on top of sea level rise. And we've built into the calculator a way to look at different return interval water levels that you would expect in these coastal projects. So these would be the monthly high, the 1, 2, 10, 20, 50, 100, etc. year return levels. But you can always enter one. If you've got a detailed hydrodynamic study, you enter those, and we're working on developing another method with NOAA that they've been working on for a while. Now we're going to be applying it for ourselves. So the middle shows the extreme water levels and frequency idea. And then in the upper left, we're showing the low, intermediate, and high curve over time. And then the user has, we've asked them to put in the FEMA base flood elevation, just to give them an idea of where FEMA thinks you're going to have a problem. Because remember, not all our projects are flood projects. They could be ecosystem, and you certainly don't want to perch your ecosystem way up here where it's not touching the water. Then we asked them to put in a threshold, and here it's the slow dashed line, and I know that some people won't be able to see this well, but if you take the slide, you'll be able to see it. Here they set the threshold for this project where performance is a problem above that point here. And so if you're looking at sea level, you think, oh, you know, high curve, 2080, not such a big deal. But now I've put the 50-year recurrence interval design water level on top of the low curve for the blue one. And you can see that we're entirely swamped. I put the on top of the intermediate curve and then on top of the high curve, and you can see that the project is going to have a problem anywhere. Oh, actually, it's the 10-year, sorry, not the 50-year. So you can see that this project is actually going to have a problem and maybe experiencing these kinds of problems already. So these easy tools allow you to get an idea of vulnerability quickly. The project has been in progress since, I guess we kicked it off in May, had some training in June last year, started moving, had a lot of issues with the GIS databases, getting them to work together, but we're about 55% complete now. There's 3 divisions that are done, Southwest, Pacific Ocean, and SPD, and we're moving right along. Actually, I think Northwest Division is about 70, SAD is about 60, and even NAD, which started late because of Sandy, they're up there in the 40 to 50 range. So we can track these online. So that was the coastal assessment, which we can do because we have policy and guidance that allows us to work on a project level basis. we're going project by project there. When we get to interior hydrology, inland issues, we don't have the resolution of the data and we don't have the policy and guidance. If you recall that the archive that I discussed earlier, where we're serving climate information and hydrology, it's at the scale of the hydrologic unit code, 4-digit code for watersheds. The HUCs are identified by the U.S. Geological Survey, and there's about 202 in the CONUS, or there is 202 in the CONUS. And so these are those watersheds colored generally by division, so that gray is New England, orange is South Atlantic, LRD is red, SPD is purple, and then these buff ones that are shown in here, these represent HUC 4s that have more than one district in them, so that the district boundary line is at a finer resolution. So essentially we've been doing a phased development of this. We did a proof of concept study to see if we could do it, and then to get information primarily from the H&H community on how to improve the work and the visualization. We're in phase 2. We built it on the new nationwide hydrology data set based on the CMIP 5 models last summer. I guess it was by May or June, we had the new data in from CMIP 5. But in the archive, somebody using the archive found that there was an error in the February data because the days of the month, and so so we revised the whole archive, which is one of the benefits of having a public archive when a researcher uses it. They tell you if there's a problem, and they tell you loudly so that you get to fix it. So we've revised that, but we haven't pulled the new hydrology in just yet. So we're working on a soft rollout. As soon as the new hydrology is in, I think by June, we'll be rolling it out publicly. It's a modular system, so it allows us to incorporate new information. We spent a lot of time in the visualization, which has been in part to support our QA/QC and also to how to interpret the results. It integrates with the Civil Works transformation, the 333 planning, the watershed budgeting, the asset management programs. And it's on the web, so it's easy to get to, and it has CAC access. And so we're going to be updating it again by May to June with the updated CMIP 5 hydrology. We're adding a special Great Lakes component next year, and then we'll add OCONUS after that. So, how does it work? First, it asks for the business lines and the functional areas, how are we vulnerable to climate change? And then using indicators, we ask, how do we represent key aspects of that vulnerability? And then once we have these indicators, how do we aggregate them and integrate them to look at business area and functional responsibilities? Again, we're doing this at the watershed basis, business line basis, and the functional area, planning, engineering, ops. We're doing it that basis rather than a particular project. So we spent a lot of time working with our contractors. We had 2 sets of contractors and several academic institutions working with us to make sure that we had a very robust method to look at constructing our composite indices, and we really looked at the trade-off, subjective weighting, data standardization, and interpretation. And when we compared them, we selected the weighted order weighted average, or WOWA method, because it worked the best across all of these 4 categories that we thought were important. And it also allowed us to decrease the likelihood of a false negative. And we're very concerned about that because we don't want to screen out a watershed and say, oh, well, you're not vulnerable, you don't have to really delve into detailed analysis, if it actually is vulnerable. So we wanted to kind of bias ourselves towards including watersheds that might not be vulnerable so that we didn't miss one that was. This is kind of our little in-house view of the process. We start up here in the upper left-hand corner. We think of this as our core map database. We extract data from Core Project Notebook. We extract data on the HUCs. We extract business line data. We put that into the tank, and then we add the climate data, the hydrologic information coming from the archive, and then we have non-hydrologic indicators as well. And we weight those indicators, and then we perform a trade-off on them. And again, I'm saying we're a little pessimistic because we don't want to screen out something that might have a problem. Then we compute that weighted order weighted average for every watershed, for every time period, for every trace. And then we put that all back to Core Map. Then we extract it into Oracle. We publish it to our Tableau server, and I like this one because it's kind of space-agey. And then we put that out to the web for people to access it. So, what does it look like? The first go around here, we're actually just visualizing the 20% most vulnerable watersheds, HUC4 watersheds. We're doing it for the business lines, most of which look at all of the watersheds, but a few only selected. So navigation doesn't have, for example, a nav project in Utah, so they're not interested in knowing whether if something in Utah looks vulnerable according to their indicators. They're only interested in the watersheds that feed their project. So hydropower, nav, and water supply are the ones that use selected HUCs. And what this picture shows us is dry scenario in this column, generally brown. When you see brown, it's dry. Wet scenario in this column, and those are generally blue. And then for year 2050, it's actually a 30-year period averaged at 2050, and then a 30-year period averaged at 2085. And the reason we're doing 30-year periods is that's how the World Meteorological Organization looks at climate in this 30-year epoch. So here what we see is that the dry, just by eye, you can see that there's a few minor changes between dry in 2050 and 2085, and maybe a few different changes between wet in 2050 and 2085. But clearly, it's not, to the eye, it's really difficult to actually see much of a big difference. So this is for the flood risk business line. This is an example. So then if I go to the dry scenario, let me go back to this one for a moment. So the water managers always would point to a watershed. They'd say, okay, tell me why that one is vulnerable. Tell me why this one is vulnerable. And that's something that just came up over and over again. So we developed a visualization where for the dry scenario for 2085 for flood, all these very faint ones are the 20% most vulnerable. And what we've done here is you can just click and drag a rectangle. In this case, we've selected these ones here. And they're reprinted down at the bottom here. And each one of those watersheds, if I were live, I would hover over the watershed and it would tell me exactly which watershed. It would say HUC, 1112, White Wabash, something or other. Tell me what the name of the HUC was. But I can't do it live because I'm having a CAC issue between DCO and my own and these CAC access programs. But anyway, at least it gives a little pie chart for each one of these. And then if I look at the indicator, I can see that this pinky one, the flood magnification factor, it seems to be the primary culprit in vulnerability of these particular watersheds. And over on the left, it shows me, again, that aggregated across all business areas, what are the 20% most vulnerable, where the darker ones are more watersheds are vulnerable. So that's one look. What's the details of the vulnerability? The next look is, how does vulnerability change over time? In this case, again, I'm looking at the dry flood risk business line, 2050, 2085. And we have the scores, the WOWA scores for each one of these watersheds goes from yellow from less vulnerable to purple to relatively more vulnerable. So you can kind of see where the purples are concentrated. So we can see that in areas that are yellow, bright dark yellow, they're much less vulnerable than others. But we really also want to see, so that tells us one thing, but we also want to see what's the percent change in vulnerability score. Because even if I have a watershed that's, say, let me just pick an example. Okay, so say it's like this watershed here. It's not showing up as a purple watershed here or here. It's just going from one yellow to another yellow, and it's hard to discern. But looking at it here, what I can see is the percent change. It's a dark red, so it's on almost greater than 10% change over the time period. And so that might have some impacts on how you plan a project or what your operations are, something like that. So looking at the percent change over time also tells you something that's different from just what's vulnerable at a given time. And again, the green areas are the ones we don't really have to worry about. They're moving towards less vulnerability. So we can do this by business line, by the dry and the wet. And we can also just look at a single indicator. So what I picked here is the coefficient of variation of the local annual flow in the watershed. And that's a measure of that variability. If you think back to the non-stationary example I used where I showed kind of the minimum flow was fairly flat before 1980, and then the variability really increased. So this coefficient of variability in annual is telling me where I could expect that coefficient of variability to lead to some vulnerability. So lower lows, higher highs. And this is also something that water managers really wanted to look at, and H&H people, they said, I just want to see for one indicator how it's behaving, because that gives me, that helps me understand my watershed better. And again, so we look at what's vulnerable, and then we look at how is it changing over time. So again, these tell us two different things. And for this one, the flood magnification factor here. So this tells us that we're changing flood magnification factors so that floods are likely to be magnified. In other words, more frequent the bigger floods will be more frequent in these redder areas. So this kind of prepares us for the kind of analysis we'd undertake in our qualitative analyses. So what do they allow us to do? Look at vulnerability, develop a relative sense of vulnerabilities regionally or in your district, get an indication of the trend in vulnerability. And again, there's no exact future. That's why we have 3 scenarios for coastal and we have wet and dry for inland. It helps us characterize the specific threats and the sensitivities, at least relatively. But it also helps us to narrow the scope of the more detailed analyses. If you're in one of those areas that didn't seem to be changing much, then you're probably not going to have to do a really expensive study. You're just going to have to deal with that risk in your risk register and your normal operating. So another kind of example of how we're looking at climate change adaptation, now that we've kind of gone through the policies and guidance and tools and the collaboration and these assessments, is just a specific example, our drought contingency plan update. Though our adaptation plans do provide specific examples from many districts on how they've incorporated climate in their plan, and we're trying to mainstream climate. So the drought contingency plan update and a partner effort, the reservoir sediment information, were started very early on because we knew that droughts were going to be an increasing problem in the future, and we knew that especially changing variable flows, would change sedimentation patterns, and that sedimentation is important in our reservoirs, especially when we need storage for flood space or for water supply, which should be impacted in the future. So the idea here was to look at our drought contingency plans, identify the current state of them, provide the information in format, identify the needs on how to update these to account for climate change, propose a way to get to that updated state, and then demonstrate through pilots how to incorporate climate change effects. So we've actually got right now 142 plans covering 301 projects, and there's fewer plans because some of them are system drought contingency plans. Most of them are over 20 years old. Here's the time from 1981 when we first had the requirement up to, I think, 2011 here. And you can see that most of them are over 20 years old. There's kind of a peak around 1992 because we had some funds then to do this work. The other thing that's important here is, in terms of drought contingency plan, we're really worried about the water supply business line. And you can see that Southwest Division has 69% of the total conservation storage. So they're kind of the big consumer of this kind of information. How are they really going to do a better job during drought contingency? But we saw that LRD, with its 6%, was very influential in the drought of 2012, when there was a great clamor for them and for Northwest Division to release flows to help navigation on the Mississippi. Interestingly, LRD's drought contingency plan did not have a navigation purpose in the plan, and so they had water supply and other, but they didn't have navigation, so they couldn't release. They weren't authorized to release water according to the drought contingency plan to support navigation. So that's the kind of problem that we have to look at in the future. When we did them 20 years ago, we may not have fully considered all the potential changes in the future. And so, again, we have a tool that we're working with so that we can visualize information. This is a peek at the Southwest drought that's going on right now in Los Angeles district. The screen on the left is the drought monitor that's put out by a variety of different agencies in the National Drought Resilience Partnership, where the colors are the darker brown is exceptional drought, and then the yellow is just abnormally dry. So we're really concerned about these dark areas. These are all of our projects. We also show, by color in this side, we show where they are, whether we have a data collection platform reading for that particular dam. whether they're at the top of normal pool or whether they're lower than the top of normal pool. So we can actually, I can click on this dot, and first of all, when I hover over it, it tells me exactly which project it is. When I click on it, I get this summary of the drought contingency plan, but I can also open up and bring the actual drought contingency plan in electronically. And I can get into the SWIMS database and I could look at the real-time flows. So it's just something was useful for us in our drought contingency plan update, but it also turns out to be useful for the drought that's going on right now, and just to give people access to information that helps them understand what's going on. So, in summary, climate is changing. We're preparing now so that we can be robust to the future changes coming. We're working to understand the impacts. In doing so, we're collaborating with other agencies and experts. We're really focusing hard on this non-stationarity. We're working well on coastal impacts and adaptation with other agencies. Again, the archive and the climate hydrology is very important in the training. We have a solid track record of developing policy and guidance. We've got data guidance, coastal guidance, and we're progressing with hydrology at a rate coincident with the best available science. So we are beginning to mainstream adaptation farther ahead in coastal, but the drought contingency plan update is an example of where we're going. And the next is the work that's being done in this program is primarily by district and other staff. So if you're a person from a district and you're interested in any of this, get in touch with us, because we love to have district folks working on this. It's all about capacity building, because it's the district folks that are going to be really dealing with the issues, and they're going to need to be creatively coming up with solutions. So in the data set, in this chart set, you'll find some additional background slides, but that's the end of the talk. So Eric, you want to take it over?
Yes, I just opened up the Q&A window. People can see the box there that appeared, and at the very bottom of that box there's a little text entry blank. Submit your questions in there, and they'll come up to me, and I'll read them to Dr. White, since she can't necessarily see what they say. And I'll try to pick those in groups that are along the same lines. Also, a couple housekeeping items. In the bottom right file share area, I have the PDFs of the presentation from part 1 that we gave on April 1st, if anybody missed it. You can click on that and download that file by clicking the file you want and save to my computer. And then, and also below that, we have a PDF of this presentation. Dr. White mentioned several slides and things if you want to go back to look at them closer up if they were hard to read on the screen or something like that. Under the web links block above the file share block on the lower right, we have a link to the Sustainability and Energy website. That's the MSRI site, so you have to create a login if you don't have one. There's also the webinar troubleshooting page if you had any trouble. If you're hearing this now, then you obviously aren't. And also at the bottom of that links, those set of links there, I have a link to the YouTube video of the part 1 climate preparedness presentation. The visual kind of came in, zoomed in. That way, we're going to see if we can fix that. But you can hear the audio that goes along with that slide deck that you can download below. Otherwise, I'll see if any questions are coming in. I haven't seen any come in yet, but we'll see what people ask. We have about just about 2 minutes before the hour. I don't see any questions coming in yet, so I guess we're ending about on time. People can download. I'll leave this this meeting up. People can download the files there as long as they want. Now, keep in mind we recreated a new website meeting link that all of you used to get to this webinar. We created a template. We had a lot of technical difficulties managing the recordings and things from the transition from DCO 1.0 to DCO 2.0. So hopefully these will flesh out a lot of those technical difficulties we've had in the future. Future email announcements will contain a link to the webinar that's the subject of the email. They may or may not be different. So look to each email for web announcements. If you have them bookmarked or whatever, you'll have to individually bookmark or put in your calendar the link to that webinar, as they may change from now on. So seeing no questions, I want to thank Dr. White again for joining us today. Very informative presentation. I'm going to have to go back through a lot of those slides myself and look more in detail into these things. But thanks again, and everyone, have a nice day.
If I could just add one more thing. I just noticed that this says draft going on for dissemination. You can share all these slides with anybody, and there's notes pages on the bottom, and most of the bottom, and it can help you. The draft going off for dissemination is only on the vulnerability assessment slide, so that people don't try to use that information in some kind of a project. We're required to do that, but I must have just copied a slide over and left this here. So go ahead and share.
Right, and the PDF files in the upper left-hand corner, if there were presenter notes that have more detailed information, those will have a little comment balloon up in the upper left-hand corner if you're not familiar with PDF slides. So that has more information in it as well. Okay, well, I will turn off the recording and call it a day. I guess a lot of people got in their questions last time, and hopefully we will see everybody next time. Look for the email announcements in your inbox. Oh, one thing to cover, for those of you who might not know, if you want the CEUs, they are available in batches of 5. Go to the MRSI site. That's the same as the Sustainability and Energy website on the link on the lower right. You can download quizzes. They usually are available not too long after the webinars. And once you fill out the quizzes for each batch of 5, the quizzes are in groups of 5, then send that with your AIA number, if applicable, to Lindsay Pruitt, and she will see to it that you get your certificate for your learning units or CEUs. Thank you for that, and everyone have a nice day.